Okay, we're going now. So, all right. First of all, everyone, welcome to the class. This is the buyer agency class. All this information is as of May 17th of 2018. I put that little disclaimer in because, quite frankly, things change constantly. You'll find out that this summer we're getting a new real estate condition report and a vacant land report that's going to be done, and there'll be changes to the home inspection reports that you'll be receiving. That's just an example of the fact that things change on a regular basis. So that's why I put the little disclaimer in there. So let me go to, nope, this is what I went right here. All right, so I didn't give you an outline, but I'll be referring to the outline of all the things that I'll be talking about on the screen here. And then when I start referring to the documents that I've given you, I'll show them on the screen, but you'll have a copy of all of them in the pack that I just gave you. So literally what I'd like to start this class with is just letting everyone know WRA does put on a buyer agency class. It's a really very good in-depth class, and I recommend that everybody take it. There is a cost to it, but once you take the class and you complete a couple buyer agency transactions, you will be able to get an official designation from WRA that you're an authorized buyer representative. I think those designations are important to get, so try to take some time to get that designation. We've had agents go through here or go through that program and take it, and they were very impressed. So what this class is just literally my impression or the things that I think all of our Keller Williams agents should know about the buyer agency. And the best thing for you to be able to look at really right now is the first handout that I've given you. It's the buyer agency. It's just a description of, let me just switch over to that. There we go. Just so I can get it on the screen here. This is just gives you an idea as to what buyer agency is and what options are available to you. In Wisconsin, a buyer agent is not an automatic position. Your automatic default when you're working with a person is that you are working for the seller. Not every state is that way. Wisconsin is one of the states where that is the case. If you ever want to get into a situation where you want to represent the buyer, you do have to enter into a buyer agency contract. But what this is just talks to you a little bit about really the basics as to what a buyer agent is and what they can do for, if you were not a buyer's agent, if you were a seller's agent, talks about the things that you're able to do, what a buyer's agent is able to do, and it gives them a good description, and this is really the best way to describe it. As a buyer's agent, you can give a negative opinion or critique on the seller's property beyond disclosing defects. Recommend or suggest an offering price or give an opinion about whether a particular house is priced too high or too low. As an agent representing a seller, you can't do that. You need to have a buyer's agency agreement in order to be able to give your opinion of the house. Structure the offer or draft the offer provision with the buyer's best interest in mind. Recommend and assist the buyer with negotiation strategies and the best prices and terms. Disclose all information and research, a property history, and liens so the buyer can make an informed decision, and give advice within the scope of the agent's expertise as to the licensed real estate professional. So what that says is, in a sentence, you're allowed to give your opinion. If you're just a standard selling agent, you're not allowed to give your opinion. You have to practice regular brokerage services, fill out the contracts, explain what the contracts are and everything, but you can't give the opinion, your opinion to the client. In order to get into a buyer agency, you do have to have a contract, and I'll be going over the contract a little later in the program. So what I think is probably the most important thing about being a buyer's agent is you have to understand what you're getting into. You have to understand what responsibilities as an agent am I taking on over and above just being a selling agent. And that's really the main purpose of this class, is to make sure you understand what you're getting into. So the way I like to best describe this is your responsibilities now equal that of the buyer. Normally, when you're a regular selling agent, you would be able to recommend to the buyer, well, why don't you go ahead and look into this and look into that. This is who you call. It's my opinion as a buyer's agent that you should go another step beyond, and actually find out that information also, not instead of the buyer, but also, so that when the time comes to decide what you're going to do with a property, that you have the same information the buyer does. I equate it as the two of you are almost buying the property together. And now your responsibilities are almost similar to that of what the buyers are. Because the buyer technically is supposed to understand what they're getting into, what they're buying, what's happening around it. It's their responsibility to look into that. As a buyer's agent, you're there to be able to assist this buyer. And I believe it's your responsibility to also look into these things too. Now, that does not absolve the buyer of looking into them. I'm not saying you should do this instead of them. What I'm saying is you should do these things with them, so that when a time comes to do something with a property, you understand what's going on with that property as much as can be found out. As a buyer's agent, though, you're still expected to operate within the law and operate ethically. You can't be steering a person, and you still cannot disclose confidential information that a seller might have given you. When it comes to confidential information, and I'll talk to you about how I handle this. As a buyer's agent, which me personally, I don't do it very often. Lately, well, I don't sell now, but my wife does. She's starting to do a lot more buyer agencies, because as we explain buyer agencies to people, they really want that service. But one of the things that often happens is a buyer's agent will call another agent. They'll start asking property, and then that other agent completely accidentally, certainly not intentionally, discloses some personal information about that seller. The sellers are going through a divorce. The sellers are financially, they're loaded, and they can do all the repairs or whatever. Those are things that common sense tells you I never should have heard. If you're listening to what a selling agent has to say, and you go, "Are you sure you want to tell me that?" It's probably they shouldn't have told you that. When I get into situations like that, I will ask, that information that you just shared with me, is it okay if I share it with the buyer? Oftentimes they'll say yes. You'll be surprised how many times they will say, yes, go ahead and share that. But every now and then they'll catch themselves and they'll go, you know what, maybe I shouldn't have said that, if you could hold off on that. That's a description or an example of the fact that you can't disclose confidential information. And in my opinion, you shouldn't disclose it even if it was accidentally told to you. So just use your better judgment as to what, if you do get confidential information that it's probably wasn't meant for you, check to make sure it's okay to tell your buyer. One of the things that you do have to do when you are a buyer's agent, you do have to do a CMA on the property that they want to place an offer on. Because it's your responsibility to be able to demonstrate to this buyer the house is worth X. The house is worth what they're asking, and then some. They have it underpriced. They have it overpriced. You'd be surprised how many times, oftentimes people will, well, they used to up until this market that we have now, but they would price a house with the thought that there is going to be negotiation taking place and it'll end up coming in lower. I had one client where we signed a buyer agency. I did a market analysis. They were $10,000 too high. We wrote the offer $10,000 below, and they accepted it. And that was in a market where it was more of a regular market, not like the market we have now where things are flying off the shelf. But this was in a more traditional market. I was able to do a market analysis to show that indeed this was priced too high. We came in at the right price. The seller probably recognized, oh, they figured out we have this price a little high. Let's just accept this offer and move forward. So it's important for you to do that. Oftentimes, it's important for you to do a market analysis to say, yep, they priced the house just right. This is what we should be paying for it. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, do you want to go right to this price? Do you want to try negotiating a little bit? Then you can have that conversation. Or you could say, look, this house is priced way under. We don't have any offers. No one else has placed an offer on it. Let's just do full price and get this buttoned up right away. That's why it's important to do the market analysis, so you can give them good advice on probably the most important part of this, and that is, what's the price of the property. You should do some research about the home and the area that you're in. Pricing, of course, like I just described, but zoning. That might be an important issue that you need to talk to the buyer about to make sure they understand what sort of zoning that they're going to be getting into. Assessments. Let me back that up to zoning. That's going to be more important if a person's going to be buying a property that maybe wants to use it for a little different than what it's currently being used. And you know, I don't know what sort of situations we're all going to run into. But let's say, for example, you have a person who wants to buy a home, but also with this home, they want to be able to run a business out of it. Well, some zoning allows that to happen. Some municipalities allow that to happen, but others don't. So that's why it's your responsibility to, along with the buyers, to look into the zoning to see if what they want to do is allowed. Now, you could certainly do that with just a phone call. Call the zoning department and say, hey, I have someone who's interested in buying this property, but they'd like to run a daycare out of it. Is that possible? Yes, but you have to do this. And then you would be able to pass that information on to the buyer, or better yet, have the buyer say, go to the buyer and say, here, call this person, let them know what you want to do, so the buyer hears it directly from the source as to what they need to do. I think that's very important, that the buyer hear it right from the source and not necessarily from you as to what they need to do with this. Assessments, that's starting to get to be more and more of an issue now this time of year, because this is the time of year cities start doing construction on the streets and sewers in the neighborhood. So you have to understand what assessments are coming, and you also have to understand how that assessment works with an offer to purchase. Generally, if a property is assessed for any work that's being done by a municipality, and it's assessed prior to the offer, the seller has to pay it. That's the way it's normally written in the offer. But let's say, for example, you write an offer. 2 weeks later, you get the seller gets a letter in the mail that says, hey, your property's being assessed for sewer work that's going to be done, and we're going to be doing that in August. That now falls to the buyer, because in the offer, it does say any assessments that are placed on the property after the accepted offer becomes the responsibility of the buyer. You can call municipalities, ask to speak to someone in their public works department, and say, is there any planned work for this street coming up? And they usually go out about 5 years. So if you've identified a property, you call the municipality, any work going to be done within these next few years? They might say none. They might say, oh yeah, in 2 years we're going to do sewer, and in 3 years we're going to do the road. You go back to the buyer, explain to them what's happening, and then now the buyer has a good idea as to what's going to happen with their property when they buy it, or a couple years after that. The last thing on earth you want to do is sell a house to a person and have them call you 6 months, a year later saying, hey, I got this bill for $10,000 from the city for work that was going to be done, and it was in their 5-year plan, so they put it out there 4 years ago. Why didn't you tell me this? Now, granted, it's still the buyer's responsibility to know that. I'm not saying again, doesn't absolve the buyer of having to look at this, but this is something that anybody can call on any property. This isn't private information, it's public information, that work is going to be done on this property. We have planned doing work on this. Then you just let the buyer know, hey, this is coming, just so you're aware of it. Then you can talk about, or have the person call the municipality. They can talk how the billing is going to be done, how the payments are going to be done, that sort of thing. Use. That dovetails well with zoning. How is the person going to use the property? Are they going to use it as a residence, or are they going to use it as a residence and business? Let's say you decide to get into the commercial world, and the person wants, and you're working with a person on a purchase, and they want to be able to use it as a retail. Well, can the property be used as a retail? Can it be converted to that? What needs to be done in order to do that? That's why it's important for you to have an understanding as to what's going on, so that when you talk to the buyer and the buyer does their own investigating, you guys can have an intelligent conversation as to what you need to do, and you'll be able to make some really good decisions. The best way to make any sort of decision is have as much information as you possibly can. And the best way to advise a person is to have as much information as you can. Development. It's probably important to understand what sort of developments are happening around the property. I can't tell you how many new constructions I've sold where I stand at the patio door, I look at the big cornfield in the back, and I think, I wonder what they're going to do there. And the buyer often says, are there any plans for what's going on back there? I said, well, you can call the municipality, which I would then do, find out if anything has been done. In order to do development, it is a long process before they even put a shovel in the ground. So the municipality would be aware of it. But usually when I advise people, if I'm in a new construction and I'm looking at a cornfield, someday that is going to be developed. What it's going to be, I don't know, but someday it's going to be developed. So just making sure they understand what could happen or what is out there. But more importantly, if you're able to find out what has already been scheduled and how far along they are and what the time frame is able to be, now again, you've got good information and the buyer is able to make a good decision at that point. And understanding what the municipalities will and will not allow. Some municipalities and I should probably add to this, subdivisions, some allow how many dogs can you have. I know in the city of Appleton, you can have, I think it's 2, 3 dogs, maybe 2, but they do limit the number of dogs that you can have. And you can't have a kennel. You can't use it for breeding. There are a number of restrictions. So, if a person's looking to buy a house, and maybe not that they're making it a business, but it's something that they do as a hobby, you're going to want to find out, can they even do their hobby in this house too? Another thing that's important to do when you are working with a buyer is understand what the motivation of the buyer is. Why is the buyer purchasing the property? Is the buyer looking to buy and hold the property, or is the buyer looking to buy and resell? Two completely different approaches to buying the same house. If a person's looking to buy and hold, more often than not, it's going to be a situation where they're buying a house for their family. So price is going to be important, but not as important as if it were an investment, because now the investor is looking to purchase this property, put in some money, turn around and sell it, and they want to be able to make a profit. They're looking to you to be able to give you your advice as to, this is what I think it's worth now. If you get it fixed up, this is what I think you could sell it at. So those are going to be two different approaches. If a person looking to buy a home for their homestead, and it's a $100,000 house, and yeah, it needs some work, and the guy's kind of handy, and they can do it. It's like, all right, well, fine, well, 90, 95, maybe $100,000, they'll purchase it. But if the guy's looking to purchase the house, let's say it's on for 100,000, and if it's all fixed up, you'll be able to spend or sell it for 120. And the guy realizes that, well, I have to put $30,000 into this house in order to be able to make any money on it. Well, paying $100,000 isn't going to work. So $90,000 has to be my upper end. So I'll come in and offer 80. So you have to understand what the buyer wants to do with the property, so you'll be able to advise the so you'd be able to advise the buyer best as to what approach are we going to take to purchase this property. Resale implications of the purchase. I think that's an important thing to look at. Is and this happens a lot. Not so much in this market now, but if it wasn't like it was right now, you would want to talk to the buyer about, well, yes, this quad is a very nice house and it's in great shape. It will work for your family. Quads do not sell as fast as single family, 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranches on the south side of Appleton. You can sell those all day long in just about any market. So if the person is looking to buy a house, and let's say, for example, they know they have to move in 5 years. Well, let's talk about resaleability. Let's concentrate on the homes that I think are going to have your best chance of being sold again in 5 years. Or a person's going to be looking, look, this is going to be my forever house. I just want to find one that's in a good shape, a nice area, plenty of room. Fine, then let's open it up. Let's look at 2 bedrooms. Let's look at quads. We'll be able to look at all of those. And then, of course, still discuss with the buyer, well, now understand, these aren't as popular as your 3-bedroom ranches, but this meets all of your needs, all your purposes. If you like this house, yeah, then let's go forward with it. So it's important to understand what the motivation is and what the resale implications are of that property, because you don't know what the buyer is going to be getting into. Again, they might have to sell in 5 years, 3 years. I've actually, June sold a house, I think it was about 2-3 years ago, to someone. He says, you know, in 5 years, I'm definitely going to move, because the company I'm with moves us around every 5 years. So in a couple of years, June's going to be calling this person going, well, you know, 5 years is up. Are you looking to move? What can I do to help? Understanding the loan program, item 2F, understanding the loan program and the ramifications of them. This is also an important thing for you to know what the different type of loan programs are. Each one are going to have their own ramifications. Hang on a second, I'm just going to change this around a little bit because I am starting to get a little warm here. Each one is going to have their own ramifications. Conventional loan, you're not going to have too many issues as far as you know, being able to have a property approved if it's a conventional loan. But if you have FHA, everyone has to understand, well, there might be some lender required repairs. And if we come to a house that's got all chipping and peeling paint, we might want to reconsider this purchase, or at least go in with the knowledge of knowing this work is going to have to be done by somebody. So let's get this figured out as to what we're going to do. FHA and WHEDA, same thing, they have lender required repairs. VA and USDA, they have zero money down. It's possible for a person to finance the entire purchase of the house, but they're also going to have lender required repairs. So it's important for you to have a pretty good idea as to what that loan program is. You don't have to be a loan expert, but you have to have some basic knowledge of all the different loan programs, and talk to them and make sure they understand what they can and cannot buy. If you have any questions, if you have a lender that you work with, contact them. They'll be able to talk to you about it. Amic is here in the building. Ryan has always said he's open for any questions about any sort of loan program, whether you're using him or not. So Ryan would be a great asset for you to be able to check in with if you have a loan question. As a buyer's agent, item 2G, you're also able to point out more facts about the house. Understand that as a buyer's agent, you're not a home inspector. You're not an engineer. So when you go through a house, you have to be careful not to portray yourself as one, but you can talk a little bit more about, you know, I see this crack in the wall. I don't know what it means, but let's make sure that we have the home inspectors pay special attention, pay special attention to this crack when they do the home inspection. Or if you notice that the wall is bowing in, let's make sure that they pay a little extra attention to this, just so we know what we're getting into. Not necessarily that a crack is bad. It's not. I mean, oftentimes it doesn't mean much, but it's something that I don't know. You don't know. So let's have the inspector talk about it. What else would you be able to point out that would be? It's not that I've done a lot of roofing, but you can look at a roof and, you know, if the shingles are starting to cup, you know, maybe this roof is getting closer to the end. I don't know how long it's going to last. Let's make sure the inspector pays a little extra attention to this. As a buyer's agent, you can do that sort of thing. As an agent for the seller, not necessarily, because now you're talking negatively about the house. You're not preventing an inspection to happen. And even as an agent working as a selling agent, encourage everybody to get an inspection. But as a buyer's agent, you can look at this and go, we maybe want to pay a little extra attention to this. Or we know it's happening, it's probably going to be issue. Let's tailor our offer in such a way where we can compensate you for this. So that's why it's nice to be as a buyer's agent. You can talk about more of these things and be able to have an open discussion with the buyer and really address some of the issues that you might see. Now, if you're not familiar with something, I don't say, you know, I certainly would never advocate that you know, if you're not familiar with roofs, don't be looking at the roof going, I'm a little worried about that. I've done enough home inspections and talked to enough inspectors where, you know, I know just enough to be dangerous. So then I stop and let the inspector take over from there. But I'm able to say, let's pay a little extra attention to this. All right, Next thing I'd like to show you guys is some of the handouts that I've given you. So let's just go down to there. Just switch over to there. The first handout that I've given you is, this is something that as an agent, you can be asking yourself. Why do I want to be a buyer's agent? And this gives you a pretty good idea of some questions you need to ask yourself and to make sure that you are comfortable being a buyer's agent. Like I said in the beginning, you're assuming some additional responsibilities. This is just a good list for you to look at. And if you ever get to the point, which I'm sure you guys will, but when you get to the point, you can look through this and go, yeah, I'm comfortable with everything on here. Then I encourage you to be a buyer's agent. But until you are really comfortable being a buyer's agent, I wouldn't do it unless, of course, you're working with someone who can help you with it. And I know both of you work with other people. Go ahead and do the buyer agency, but don't be afraid to ask for help from people on your team. It's terribly important that you do, because like I said, as a buyer's agent, even if you're part of a team, you're assuming, you individually are assuming additional responsibilities. So when you do it, if you're not able to be comfortable with everything on here, ask someone on your team to help you out. This here is a nice side-by-side description as to something that you'd be able to give your buyer as, this is the difference between me being a selling agent and me being a buyer's agent. Kind of gives a nice side-by-side description as to what you can and cannot do. So this is a great thing to be able to hand a person and say, hey, you know, this is why I'm recommending me being a buyer's agent. This is another handout that I have. Again, it explains to the buyer the difference between being a customer or you working with them as a selling agent or a client. Anytime I reference the word client, you have a contract with them. But if I say the word customer, you're working with them, but you don't have a contract. So this is another nice form for them to be able to have too. And it gives them a pretty good idea as to what they can expect as expect from you as being a buyer's agent. Now on item 3B, it's important to you that you explain the buyer agency contract to the buyer. Now I'm not going to go over the entire contract today. That'll be the subject of another class. But this is the buyer agency contract. What I would recommend you do is read through this, and you're going to find that there are a lot of parts of this that are similar to that appear in the offer to purchase, that also appear in the listing contract. There's a lot of similarities within the contracts, but the purposes of each one are a little different. And this is the one that authorizes you to operate on behalf of the buyer in the purchase of property. It's important that you do, up here on line 1, strike which agent you're not going to be like. Are you going to be a buyer's agent or a tenant rep? Buyer's agent is someone who purchases. Tenant rep is someone who's looking to lease property. You can be both. It's okay to leave both of them open, but the vast majority of your time, you're going to be one of the two, and most likely buyer's agent. So make sure you cross off tenant rep. You do need to put in a price range here as to what that's going to be. Even though you put in a price range, and let's say your buyer now changes their mind and they want to go up to a higher price, with this new contract, you're still covered. If there's any excluded properties that, let's say a buyer you're working with had looked at a number of other properties with another agent, gave up on that agent, and now is working with you as a buyer's agent. Just because you have a buyer agency agreement with a person, procuring cause still trumps a buyer agency agreement. So in other words, if that person saw some homes with another agent, that other agent has a right to that buyer if they purchase that home, but only those homes. So you can exclude those properties. You can tell the buyer, I understand that you've looked at those other properties. It wouldn't be ethical or proper of me to try to work with you on those homes because you've seen them with someone else. So I'm going to exclude them from the contract. That would actually appear here in lines 21 through 24, excluded properties subject to a prior agreement. Maybe the buyer appears on a protected buyer list. with another agent. That would be something that would appear here. On line 17 through 20, this is where you'd put in the type of properties the buyer doesn't want. So I kind of mixed this up a little bit for you on that, and I'm sorry. So on line 17 through 20, put in there the type of properties the buyer doesn't want. I don't want commercial. I don't want to be in Fond du Lac. I don't want to be in Sheboygan. I want to remain Appleton or the Fox Valley area. Don't limit yourself too much. Don't get too specific unless the buyer is actually very specific. I have to live in this school district, so therefore I only want to look for homes in this area. You can limit it to that. I necessarily wouldn't suggest that. You can definitely make your searches limited to that. But as far as the buyer agency agreement goes, if they're specific, I would make it just a little bit wider, just in case they say, well, you know what? We've been looking in this area, we can't find anything. And as long as we're close, I'm okay with living in Harrison as opposed to actually having to be in Kimberly. So so that's why I always recommend making it a little bit bigger. You don't want to make that too specific. You can make the excluded properties very specific if you want. Compensation. You have to put down here what your compensation is going to be. You have to fill in something. 2%, 3%. I've seen buyer agencies contracts at 6% and they get it. I will only accept MLS compensation. You know, there are a lot of buyers that, you know, they want you to be the buyer's agent, but they're really not financially in a position to be able to pay you extra. So you can put in there, you know, that's fine. I understand. I will just take whatever they give me in MLS. Just remember though, if you find it for sale by owner, they're not in the MLS, therefore there's no promise of compensation. So what I would probably do is, if you're going to do the MLS, or just say, I'll accept MLS compensation, or with a for sale by owner, it'll be 3%. Now it's important for the buyer to understand that if in the event they find a house and they are going to potentially pay a commission, you have to let them know this is coming. You know, I found and that's only going to happen pretty much with a for sale by owner. So you have to let them know, all right, I found this for sale by owner, but I've talked with the seller. They are animate to not pay me. So Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we'll have to make out some sort of arrangement for me to be compensated directly from you, which is perfectly legal. At the closing, they can go ahead and write us a check for Keller Williams and pay our buyer agency fee. That's an acceptable thing to do. But the buyer has to know that whatever we negotiate in this offer, they're going to have to come in with an extra 2 or 3% to be able to pay your commission. They do it. It's not like it's unheard of. It happens. The important thing is, though, you need to make sure the buyer is aware that this could happen. Let's say, for example, the property is listed with MLS and you have a contract straight across the board, 3%, everything. And in MLS, let's say you're only able to negotiate 2%. Well, that extra 1% is now going to have to come from the buyer, and the buyer is going to need to know that that could happen. Now, there are plenty of buyers who are going to have the ability to do that, especially if a buyer has a lot of money down. They could maybe divert some of that from the down payment to pay your commission. Or they just have plenty of money, they're going to put their 20% down, and they have the additional, let's say, 1 percentage point to make up the difference. You have the additional $2,000 to pay you for the buyer agency fee. It happens. I mean, it's not like it's unheard of. It does happen. But probably the most important thing about the contract is you have to make sure they understand that the potential does exist where you could pay a commission. What I advise you to do is let them know well in advance if we were getting even close to this situation, just so they're aware of it, and just so you can have that conversation right at the beginning and not when we get closer to closing and now we have a disagreement as to who's going to make up that extra point. So it's better to get these things taken care of well in advance. The rest of this page talks about how the commission is paid, how it's earned, very similar to that you get in the listing contract. Again, general provisions about everything, firm's duties, cooperation, the same thing that you'll find in other contracts. This is a good section that I like to have everyone review, and that's disclosure to clients. This is the information that that's in writing in the contract, where you're able to demonstrate this is the difference between me working with you as a customer and me working with you as a client. Now, the first half is this is the responsibilities that are due to all parties. So this is this first part, line 73 through 85. This is what I owe to you or to a customer. This is what I owe to everybody. And just go over those point by point. But because I've entered into a buyer agency agreement with you, these are now the additional duties. These are additional duties that I owe you because now we have a client relationship. And if you can see and you look at those, it does describe pretty nicely. I can give you advice. I can help you negotiate. I can talk to you about these different things. And we can really get a far better price for you, likely, because now I'm able to give you this additional information. Also in here, it talks about multiple representation. This is by far the most difficult part of any contract, is multiple representation. Multiple representation with designated agency. Get that there. You know what? Let me get my picture out of everyone's. Nope, it's got to stay there. Okay. When I get to this point on the contract, I don't even bother reading all of this because, quite frankly, these three examples that they have here are truly the best way to describe the differences that they're going to be running into. And it gives you, in common phrases and in an understandable sentence, it describes the difference between the different ways you will be able to work with them. So the first one is the same firm. Anytime you see the word same firm, think Keller Williams. So Keller Williams may represent me and the other party as long as the other agent is not representing us both. As long as the same agent is not representing us both. So if you're working with a buyer and you're trying to, and you have a buyer agency and you find a Keller Williams home, by checking line 1, they're saying, yes, I agree to this relationship. One thing I should probably comment on this before I go any further. This whole section only deals with you having a buyer agency agreement and your buyer wanting to buy a Keller Williams home. If they want to buy Coldwell, this section doesn't matter at all. If they want to buy, Century 21, any other, this section doesn't come into play at all. If you're working with a person as a customer, so let's say you're working with a buyer, you have a customer relationship, and they want to buy a Keller Williams home, this section doesn't come into play at all. This only comes into play when you have a buyer agency agreement and they want to buy a Keller Williams home. That's the only time this section comes into play. So the first one says, yeah, I'm all right if we go ahead and buy another Keller Williams home as long as I have you as my agent and they have another agent. I'm okay with that. The next one is, I'm okay with the same firm representing me, but I want each of the agents or the one agent that's involved to be neutral. In other words, you stop giving your opinion. You stop helping. You're literally an order taker at that point. That would come into play if you have a property listed and you have a buyer agency agreement and that buyer wants to buy your house. That's where that would really come into play. The last one is the same firm cannot represent both parties in this transaction. This is where they're saying, I do not want to buy a Keller Williams home. I'm not going to buy a home that's listed by your firm. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Now, understand, this is a statewide form. This is used throughout the entire state. This is used through commercial transactions, everything. So they have to have situations that cover every event. In Appleton, checking number 3, line 122, is impractical because there's so many agents and there's so many homes listed. It's impractical to say, let's limit what we're going to look at. Let's just eliminate an entire firms. But 1 and 2 would be much more likely to come into play. You're going to have to find out from your buyer which one they're more comfortable with. I always like selecting number 1 because now you're able to look at the buyer and go, I'm working for you and only you. Now understand that if I were to have a listing contract, okay, and I'm having this exact same conversation with, I'm listing the home with you, I'm working with you and only you. So now let's say, for example, you want to buy her house. And I've looked at each one of you and I said, I'm working for you and only you. That doesn't work any longer. You can change your designation on this form to the other one through an amendment. And the only way I would be able to work with the two of you is if the both of you agree to that change. So let's say, KC, you say, yeah, I'm fine. Go ahead and act in the neutral position. I'm okay with that. But is it Jolene? Jolene, you say, no, Pete, I want you to be my agent. You agree to that? I want to hold you to that, which is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. I then now have to find another agent to work with KC, because I can't do both. So so then we revert to the same firm but two different agents representing. If that situation ever comes up, you see me and I talk you through it, and if I have to assign another agent, I will. So sub-agency, it talks about what that is. Again, that's the same thing that you'll appear in the listing contract. All of these are pretty much the same, non-exclusive relationship. This is just letting the person know that even though I have a buyer agency with you, I'm going to have other buyer agency agreements too with other agents. I mean, with other buyers. Just letting them know that that's going to happen. Non-discrimination, just make sure you don't discriminate. Dispute resolution, that's always in these contracts, definitions. We'll just shoot to, this is the rental provision page. This talks about that if you're going to be working with the person to find a rental, you would then fill in the information on this page. And then the last page is the usual delivery of documents form, just like you have on the offer to purchase or the listing contract. Within any contract, there's always needs to be a way to get documents back and forth between the contract. This does not affect the offer to purchase. This just talks about how are we going to pass contracts back and forth to one another within the buyer agency contract itself. There aren't a lot of times when things have to be sent back and forth, not like it is with the offer to purchase, but there are times when you might have to do an amendment. How am I going to get that amendment over to you? Can you sign electronically? How are you going to get it back to me? You still have to have that. You still have to have that spelled out in the buyer agency agreement. And then, of course, on the bottom, the signatures where you normally do. This is if it's individual people who are selling, they're actually four different, or buying, I should say, they're actually four different spots. If you're working with an entity, an investor who has an LLC, they would sign and put in their name here. And then as an agent, of course, you would sign down here. So if and when you guys do get into a buyer agency agreement, let me know. I can talk you through this a little bit more, or of course, the two of you are working with someone, you'll be able to reach out to them and they'll be able to walk you through this a little bit too. You can also always call if you have well, let's see, neither one of you would have a transaction mentor, so that won't be necessary. Call your team member or call me. I'll be able to walk you through it. The best thing for you to do though, is take some time ahead of time, go through this contract, and if you have any questions, reach out to me, okay? All right, on to item number 4. When you're a buyer's agent, you have the ability to write the offer in favor of the buyer. Now, anytime you go through an offer, there's, and I'm sure as you go through it, you'll see, oh, there are certain things here that favor the buyer, maybe more than the seller. When you're a buyer's agent, you'll definitely be able to write the offer in favor of the buyer. Always think about negotiating in favor of the buyer. Remember, you're going to be the buyer's advocate, so you need to be thinking about how can I structure this offer in such a way where it's going to benefit my buyer and maybe not necessarily the seller. Now understand, with any offer, you have to come to an agreement between the buyer and the seller. As a buyer's agent, you're going to be writing the offer as a buyer, I mean, in favor of the buyer. But remember, the seller is going to have an agent and they're going to be looking to, well, all right, I want to put this more in favor of the seller. That's when the negotiation begins. The appraisal contingency is one of the other places. How are we going to handle the appraisal contingency? If you are a buyer's agent, I recommend using the appraisal contingency in the offer to purchase. If you're a selling agent, I recommend the addendum A. The difference between the two is the appraisal contingency in the offer does not have a right to cure. So what that means is if we get an accepted offer and the seller agrees to the appraisal contingency in the offer to purchase, let's say it's a $120,000 house, the appraisal comes in at $117,000. At that point, the buyer can unilaterally decide, I wish to cancel the offer and move forward because I used the appraisal contingency in the addendum A, and I'm sorry, in the offer to purchase. I used the appraisal contingency in the offer to purchase. And that says this property is going to appraise at or above, and if it doesn't, the buyer has the right, it's not automatic, but the buyer has the right to remove the offer if they wish. Now, the buyer could say, even if you select the one in the offer to purchase and it comes in low, the buyer could say, you know what, see if the seller would be willing to lower the price. And then you go call the other agent, hey, the appraisal came in low, are you guys willing to lower the price? The seller might say, yeah, if it only came in $2,000, $3,000 low, sure, we'll go ahead and lower the price. Or the seller could say, nope, not going to do it. Or the seller could say, well, let's see if we can meet in the middle someplace. And then the buyer and seller can negotiate something in the middle. Just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean you have to do something. So in this case, the buyer has the right to cancel the offer, but they don't have to. They can still negotiate with the seller if they wish. But let's say we've had a horrible transaction up to this point, and the buyer is going, oh, geez, what did I get myself into? And then the appraisal comes along, it comes in low, and they had the appraisal contingency in the addendum in the offer to purchase. I'm out of here. This is the opportunity I was waiting for. I'm canceling the offer and move forward, and the seller has no control over that. Now, if you use the appraisal contingency in the addendum A, that's different. In the addendum A, it says if the appraisal comes in low, the seller has the right to decide if they're going to lower the price or not. Doesn't care what the buyer thinks. If it comes in low, the seller has the right to lower it to that appraisal price. So let's say, again, the same horrible transaction that's happened, the appraisal comes in low, buyer thinks, oh, great, I can get out of it now. It said, no, we had the appraisal contingency in the addendum A that says the seller has the right to cure and then still expect you to purchase the property. Now, let's say, again, the $120,000 house, appraisal comes in at 117 and the seller says, nope, I'm not lowering it. I am not going to lower it at all. Now the buyer has the right to cancel the offer if they wish. Or you, again, negotiate something in between. You can still do that too. In my opinion, whenever you are an agent for someone, if someone's your client, what was the point I was going to make? Oh gosh, I went blank. I'm sorry. Don't you hate it when that happens? Oh, that's it. I remember now. Put your client, if there's ever a time where you're able to make your client have the chance to have the first decision, that's the best position to be in. Because the person who makes the first decision has the most control. So again, in this appraisal contingency, if you use the one in the offer to purchase, the buyer decides what they want to do. Do I want to cancel? Do I want to still go ahead and buy it and I'll pay the difference? Do I want to negotiate? The buyer gets to make that first decision. In the addendum A, the seller gets to make those exact same first decisions. Do I want to lower the price? Do I not want to lower it? Do I want to negotiate something? Whenever you have someone as a client, and in this case, if you have a buyer agency, if you have any opportunity to let your buyer make the first decision, that's really the position you should be in. Inspection right to cure or not to cure, item 4C. Just like I described with the appraisal, same thing happens with inspections. When you get to the inspection section, you could say that this offer is contingent on a home inspection within 21 days. And then towards the bottom, there's a section that talks about who's going to have the right to, or whether the seller shall or shall not have the right to cure. Now, this one you got to be careful on, because I've seen this part literally negotiated in counter offers, and it be the only thing. Whether the seller has the right to cure or the buyer has the right to cure, or whether the seller does or does not have the right to cure. If you're ever working with a short sale, foreclosure, property that's being sold as is, do not give the seller the right to cure. Because what that means is, if you do a home inspection, you come through and they find a defect that no one knows about, the buyer now has the right to say, I'm out of here. Unilaterally, I'm out of here. I'm done with it. If the seller does not have the right to cure. But if the seller does have the right to cure, the seller has the right to fix any problem, any and all problems, and still expect the buyer to purchase. So if you have a house where you go through and you tour it and it's great, and the home inspector comes through and goes up in the attic, and the attic is covered in mold, which has happened to me, the seller had the right to cure. The seller has the right to fix it, and then the buyer is still expected to purchase the property. Now, with that being said, let's pretend that you have a buyer with children who have horrible asthma, who have horrible mold allergies or whatever. That's something important for you to know, so that you can address that in the offer when you do it. You can either say the buyer does not have the right, or the seller does not have the right to cure. Or you can put it in the additional provisions. If mold is found in the house, seller shall not have the right to cure. There are additional things that you can put in there to help protect your buyer. And that's why it's important to understand what your buyer is looking for and what's important to them. Generally, in this market though, where it is so competitive, you have to be careful what you select as to whether the seller shall or shall not have the right to cure. Because you could have 3 offers and all be the same thing, but the only difference is yours offer does not give the seller the right to cure, and the other 2 does. I could see how the seller would now exclude your offer, because the seller wants to have control, and they don't want the buyer to bolt over the littlest thing. So you have to balance that with the market. You have to, and this is something that, when you have a chance to take my what class was that? How to compete in a competitive market. I talk more about that, where you have to check the balance between, I want to compete, I want to get this house, but I also want to protect the buyer. Just something real quick from that class is, whenever you're in a competitive market, you have to write the offer, and everything that you do to become more competitive is at a detriment to the buyer, but a benefit to the seller, because you want this offer to look as appealing to the seller as possible. But the only way to do that is to make things harder on the buyer. The buyer has to be aware of that, and they have to understand, and you have to understand their comfort level in order to be able to put together an offer that's going to work for them. Possible negotiation strategies you could use. Item 4C, or 4D, I should say, an escalation clause. That's something that you'll be able to put in. If you go into dotloop, you look under various clause verbiage or whatever, you'll see the 2 different escalation clauses that are in there. What that does is allow you to pay higher than another offer at a predetermined upper limit. So take some time, review the escalation clause, and that's one thing that you'll be able to do to maybe make your offer more beneficial for the buyer. The initial offer terms, just go over the offer with the buyer and just try to understand what terms are going to work out best for you, yet still make this appealing to the seller. Home inspection negotiations. Do you want to have a home inspection? Don't you want to have a home inspection? I always encourage people to have that home inspection. We're not home inspectors. I'm certainly not an expert. I would encourage them to have that done. Radon testing. Talk to them about the need for a radon test. If you know they have a lot of kids and are maybe going to, or that they're going to be in the basement a lot, you might want to say, this is where radon collects, is in the basement. You might want to consider having a radon inspection or not. Home warranty coverage, you'll be able to talk to them about their option to be able to get a home warranty if they want, whether they're going to ask the seller to pay for it or if they're going to pay for it themselves at the closing. And talk to, we've got brochures all over the place here where you'll be able to give them information about it and have them read for themselves. Well, and septic inspections. It's important for you to make sure they understand that probably with any loan they get and the house has got a well and septic, they're going to have to get an inspection. The inspection company, I'm sorry, no, the finance company is going to make them get an inspection on the well and septic. Even if they don't want it, the finance company is going to insist upon it. Suggest possible additions to the offer, as in, do you like the bar stools? Do you want to add that in? The window treatments, the mirrors, whatever. What is there anything in the house you'd like to include in the offer? You have the ability to be able to ask them that if you want, and then see what they have to say. Remember, you still have to balance that with what kind of market are you in. Right now, we're in a seller's market, huge seller's market. So you want to be careful what you put in there. This market will not last forever. It will change at some point. And so then your strategies are going to have to change a little bit too. So you have to balance being a buyer's agent with the current market that you're in. Make sure the buyer understands what they're getting into and let them make the decision. Buyer agency and a for sale by owner. You have to have a buyer agency agreement in order for you to work with a for sale by owner. Any real estate transaction you do, you have to have a contract with them. You have to have a contract with them. You can still work with the buyer if you're working with them, if you're purchasing a FSBO, but you can also work with the seller. The important thing is, though, you have to make sure that seller understands, I'm not working for you. I'm working for the buyer. I can work with you, but I'm not working for you. And I think it's important for them to understand that. You can provide documents to the seller. Let's say you find a for sale by owner and they don't have a condition report done. They don't have an addendum S done. You can give them our condition report and addendum S and ask them to fill it out. Perfectly acceptable thing to do. The seller should sign certain documents if you're putting an offer in on a for sale by owner. They need to sign the broker disclosure to customer, the e-consent, the KW seller disclosure, and the affiliated business arrangement. Those are all forms that we have in dotloop. Those are all forms that are normally signed by a seller. These are important forms that if you're working with a buyer and you're buying a FSBO, you have the seller buy these forms. And before you guys go, I'll print off this outline for you to make sure you have the notes that I'm reading off of too. I think that'll help quite a bit. I already went over the designated agency and when we were going over the buyer agency contract. So I already went over those different things. And I talked about, the 3 different types. And when it's your listing and your buyers want the home, I already talked about that. So we don't need to go into that anymore. But what I would like to do, finally, is go over the urban legends in regards to buyer agency. Now, these were written by Corey Lamont. She's, I believe, the head attorney for the Wisconsin Realtors Association. Very nice, very intelligent lady. I always enjoy listening to her speak. But these are just some basic urban legends that, it really puts buyer agency, or gives you a really good understanding as to what buyer agency is like. So the first one is, being a buyer's agent means automatic procuring cause. The truth is, in terms of procuring cause, the pressing question is, who caused the buyer to make the offer that resulted in the sale of the property? There is no one act which determines procuring cause. It can only be answered by a full and knowledgeable consideration of all the facts of the case. The broker who can show an uninterrupted series of events that resulted in the successful transaction with the actual buyer will be the procuring cause for the sale. A buyer agency does not supersede or dictate procuring cause. So you can have a buyer's agency agreement with someone. You can be showing them properties for years. If they all of a sudden completely out of the blue go to another person, tell that person they don't have a buyer agency agreement, and write an offer on another house, You might have an issue with that buyer, but you don't have an issue with that agent, nor that purchase. So you've lost out on that commission. Now, that being said, in the buyer agency agreement, it says if you buy a property with someone else, you still owe me a commission. You would literally have to then sue the buyers in order to get your commission. But just the fact that you have a buyer's agency agreement and they write and purchase a home with someone else, it's not automatic that you have procuring costs. There's a whole lot more to it. And it's conceivable where they would go with another agent. I mean, with the two of you, it's inconceivable. But they could go with another agent, write an offer, not tell anybody about the buyer agency agreement. That other agent could sit there and ask them, are you working with someone? Do you have a buyer agency agreement? That buyer could say, no, I do not. I'm not working with another agent. Oh, that other agent thinks, okay, everything's fine. I've checked. It's impossible to verify, but they checked with the buyer. They said no. You go ahead and write it. They then have procuring cause for that commission. You do not. You might have an legal action against the buyer, but on that other agent and the commission, you don't. In the offer, buyer brokers are prohibited from asking for the seller to pay their fees. The truth is, a buyer's broker may ethically suggest or recommend that the buyer ask the seller to pay some of the buyer broker's entire fee pursuant to Article 6 of the Code of Ethics and NAR case interpretation of 16-12. I won't read the whole thing. But in the Addendum A, there's a specific section where it says, seller agrees to pay the buyer broker fee. And in the buyer agency, it talks about, there's a section that says, as a buyer's agent, and you, my client, you're going to agree to the fact that a third party will pay me for the services I'm providing you. And that's really what this is. A third party is paying me to do the services for you. See, normally in a contract, it's just two people. You perform a service, I pay you, we're all good. But you have to get special permission from all parties, which in the buyer agency and in the offer to purchase, it's in there, where it says, it's okay, I'm working for you, but they're going to pay me, and you're okay with this. Oops, I skipped that one. You don't have a buyer's agent to work with. You don't have to be a buyer's agent to work with a buyer when the property is a FSBO. No. The truth is, licensees may not provide brokerage services to a client or a customer without an agency agreement authorizing those services. You have to have a contract with somebody in that transaction. You can't go into a transaction where you don't have a contract with anyone and then now you provide brokerage services for them. You cannot do that. So if you're working with a buyer and they're interested in a for sale by owner, make sure you have a buyer agency contract signed with them prior to showing them any for sale by owners. Number 4, a buyer cannot fire a buyer's agent. Truth is, buyers have the power to revoke a buyer agency contract at any time. This is because an agency contract, such as the WB 36, is a personal service contract based upon a special relationship of trust and confidence in the broker. When a buyer directs a broker to stop searching for a property, the broker must obey the instructions. The buyer can only terminate by delivery of written documents. The power to revoke, however, is not a right to do so. Canceling a buyer agency agreement may violate the broker's rights under the contract. In that event, the broker may demand compensation for the damages sustained as a result of the cancellation. In other words, if you have a buyer agency agreement and you're looking, and finally the buyer says, you know what, I just want to cancel this. I don't want to go forward any longer. You then have a right to say, fine, I will cancel it. Here's my bill for everything I've done for you so far. You have a right to do that. I've never seen anyone do that, but you have a right to do that. This situation comes up much more with a listing contract, where a seller says, I want to list my home. It's great, you know, let me buy this advertising, let me do this, let me spend hours loading this into the MLS, hosting open houses, all that sort of stuff. I've changed my mind, I don't want to sell. Okay, that's fine. Here's my bill for everything I've done so far. They have a right to cancel the contract. You have a right to present them a bill for services that you've provided. If you wish to provide them a bill for services provided, it is very best practice for you to have a separate sheet that details, this is how much everything I'm going to do, this is everything I'm going to do, and this is how much it's going to cost. And if you cancel the bill, I'm going to, or you cancel the contract, I'm going to charge you for all these things. That's the best practice if you wish to do that. I don't see many people do that. I see people do that for listing contracts. That I've seen, and because, you know, people do put in a lot of time and effort for that. I can understand putting in a bill for that. I've never seen anyone do it for a buyer's agency, but that doesn't mean you don't have a right to do it. All I'm saying is, if you wish to do something like that, it's important for you to have a discussion with the client ahead of time, letting them know, if this happens, I will be presenting you a bill, and this is how much all of my services are going to cost. And number 5, this is the last one, I believe it is. A buyer's agent is required to give a copy of the broker disclosure to client form to the listing broker. No, you do not have to give this contract to anybody. The buyer's agent is not required by license law to provide the listing company with a copy of the broker disclosure to clients, which is contained in the WB-36. Those documents remain with the brokerage. It's my responsibility to make sure all the proper documents are signed. So whenever you submit a loop to me, that's one of the things I'm going to be looking for. I'm going to look on the offer. It's going to indicate that you're a buyer's agent. One of the next things I'm going to look for, that buyer agency agreement had better be in the loop, or I will return it to you and ask you to put it in. It's a broker responsibility to make sure our disclosures and our contracts with our clients are in-house. We do not share them with someone else. So the only contracts we share with the other party are what's actually in the offer to purchase. And that's going to be the offer, the addendum A, S, TR, real estate condition report, addendum B maybe, pre-approval letter, because all of those are mentioned in the offer to purchase. Here, this is our offer, everything's here, go ahead and look at it. I'm not going to give you a copy of my buyer agency agreement. I'm not going to give you the broker disclosure to clients or the electronic consent. That stays in-house. And that's it. The last 2 forms I have for you are just some helpful forms for like a checklist for preparing an offer. And the next checklist is things that you should have for when the time comes to write an offer. That's my buyer agency class. Do you two have any questions? I went over a lot of things, but I'm hoping that between the handouts and the outline that I'll make a copy for the 2 of you when we get done here, that you've got a pretty good idea as to, you know, some things you should be at least thinking about and considering before you become a buyer's agent. So do you have any questions? No, just submit them once you have an accepted offer with that person. Yes, yes. No, that ain't, that won't be necessary. Casey, any questions? Right, right. And you know, that's actually a good point. The question was there any way you can go ahead and protect yourself a little bit more for procuring cause? And one of the things that I find always works best is having a consultation, a sit-down meeting with the buyer before you even begin to show houses. And just sit down with them and explain the process, explain how it goes looking for a house, the things that you're going to need to do. Talk about the buyer agency agreement. I never ask them to sign it there because I don't want to be that pushy guy. Here, sign this contract. I never want to be that. But I want them to have it in their hand so they can look at it and consider it. But what I also do is I sit down with them and I go, and this is literally how it is verbatim. Wisconsin's got some very strange laws when it comes to real estate. First of all, I automatically work for the seller. And you'll be surprised how many buyers don't realize that. The default position in the state of Wisconsin is I work for the seller. That's why I explained the buyer agency contract, because I need to have a contract with you in order to be able to work for you and not the seller. And they understand that. They get that. But another thing is there's another thing that we have that we deal with on a regular basis, and that's called procuring cause. In other words, who's the person who actually sold the property? What I'm asking you, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, is if you see any property, you only call me. Do not call the listing agent. Don't call your friend, whatever. Call me. I will get that information for you. Don't go into a house with anyone but me, because if you do, I can't work with you. It's that simple. If you do look with someone else, I can't work with you on that property. Ethically, it would be impractical for me to do that. Therefore, I'm not going to step on another agent's toes, because now you've started working with someone else. So if you see anything, call me. Don't even talk to another agent. I mean, I know it sounds a little needy, a little weird, but then I explained to them, and this is a true story that happened to me. I had clients drive by an open house, got there late. The agent was just coming out of the house. My clients go up, hey, I'm working with Peter Stick. Can I see the house? We're late for the open house. Sure, no problem. Guy opens the door, they walk through, and my commission followed them right out that door. Because now that agent's able to say, well, I was at the house, they stopped by, they asked me to see it, not you. I showed it to them. They asked me all sorts of questions about the house. I answered it. They liked it. They asked me to write the offer. Or no, they said, no, I'm going to ask Pete to write the offer. She said, okay, because now that our agent has already known that I got them through the door, I helped them negotiate because I answered all their questions. Therefore, I have procuring cause. Now, it can be much more complicated than that, but that agent now has a good case. Maybe not the best in the world, but a good one. So that's and the way I find to keep that at a minimum is you meet them at a coffee shop or you meet them in the office and you just sit down and explain it to them. This is how it works. I know it stinks. I agree with you, but this is what we got. So I just respectfully ask you always run everything through me and never contact another agent. I think once you have that description and use that story to, this happened to my broker and it's my broker and it happened to them. Then they get it and they go, you know what? All right, I understand it's weird. You guys think it's weird too, but that's the way it is. So therefore, I'm going to honor it. That's the one thing that I found worked really good in keeping people with you, is to just have that personal meeting ahead of time, talk about how everything goes, and then go start showing them houses. Do you guys have any other questions? Well, thank you for being my guinea pig. This is great. This is great. Now I just got to figure out how to turn this thing off, and I think I'll be okay. There we go. Stop.